This podcast is recorded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam peoples.
British Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is June 24th, 2021, and this is episode 245.
I'm Stratta Luneboom.
And I'm Ian Bushfield. On today's show, we turn our attention to federal politics. The House has just risen, and a lot is happening there, and a lot could be happening very soon. But before we get into that, I just want to take a minute to acknowledge the announcement today from the Cowessess First Nation of the 751 unmarked graves that they found at the Maryville Indian Residential School. We're not going to touch on this as a main story. We touched on the Kamloops discovery a few weeks ago. There's still a lot to be processed, I think, around this discovery that's quite large. I do recognize the impact of this. There's so many facets to it, and in the responses, this is an instance where the nation says that the church removed the headstones in 1960. Like this, they emphasize this is not a mass grave. This is a cemetery that grew over time in this residential school that closed in 1997 when I was in school. So, very tough day. As always, thank you to the 103 people who contribute to keep this show going every month. You can join them at patreon.com/Politicoast. Politicoast is in partnership with BC Today, British Columbia's daily newsletter dedicated exclusively to BC politics. Sign up for a free trial to have unique coverage of the BC legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners to Politicoast enter the offer code CITIZEN for access to a special rate. For your free 2-week trial of the newsletter, go to politicstoday.news/free-trial. Let's jump into the main segment of the day. Hate to leave you hanging. The House of Commons has risen as the Minister of Justice introduces a hate speech bill just to drop that on the floor before peacing out for the summer.
They do that because there's likely to be an election this fall, late summer, and they're leaving a bunch of signature pieces in the mid-process so they can make the case for why they need to be reelected.
I really struggle to see the value of running on a hate speech bill. That is controversial at the best of times. It doesn't feel like a good wedge issue to me.
It's not that depends who you're dealing with. The Liberals are doing their tried and true. You need to vote for us or to keep the Conservatives out, pitch to NDP voters. That would probably be a useful part of that. But yeah, it's not going to win over kind of the probably CPC Liberal Party swing voters. It's just not the type of issue that's a big motivator for them.
So we'll get into the legislation that's on the order paper, including the hate speech bill and other things like that, and what has been passed in a minute, because I think that's interesting to dig through. It's worth noting, of course, that the Senate is going to continue meeting next week. They're scheduled at least Monday, because I think they want to do things like pass the Budget Implementation Act, which
That'd
is
be a useful one to have.
Yeah, that lets things like the wage subsidy continue through the summer that a lot of small businesses are still relying on. I know the music class my child watches that's based out of Ottawa, it's doing online courses right now, but they usually do in person. They're very dependent on the wage subsidy because they can't do their in-person classes, so they can't make the same amount of money as they usually would. So that's a big part of how they've stayed in business. They're really uncertain whether they're going to have that for the next few months because this budget hasn't passed. So a little more certainty would be good for some of those types of creatives and business owners. But you mentioned it already, rampant election speculation. Should we just dig into the basics of it? Like, why?
Oh, because the Liberals are sitting at over 40% in Ontario and pretty comfortable in Quebec, and that's a solid majority territory right there.
It's tough, though. The polls aren't that bullish on them. Right now, I'm looking at the 338 Canada average. They're at 35.8%, plus or minus 4.8%. The Conservatives are at 30%. The NDP is at 19%. Bloc at 6.9% and Greens at 6.3%. if you scroll down to their seat projections, the Liberals are are a bit short of a majority. They need, I think, 165 seats to have a majority, and they're floating right at that level. Like, it's not a comfortable, guaranteed win situation. Elections are pretty unpredictable. Like, they have a functional majority right now because the NDP is not going to bring them down for a while. They could also work with the bloc. Like, I'm still boggled as to what they hope to get out of this that's significantly different than what they have.
The seat projections depend a bit on how efficient their vote is. They have a fairly efficient vote compared to the other parties, and I looked at the regional breakdown. It is actually pretty favorable to them in a way, and if they can even just claim a percent or more on top of that, they'll probably be in majority territory. Like, they're right on the borderline there.
But things can easily swing the other way. Like, I struggle to see Aaron O'Toole really catching fire in a way that they've struggled to so far. But he doesn't need to catch fire and necessarily swing to get a Conservative majority. He could still impede the Liberals from holding on to what they have, or the NDP could swing some additional seats back from the Liberals.
Probably not that last one. I'm a little less bearish on O'Toole. I think the trouble of being an opposition leader in the pandemic has really hurt him, and he's a pretty decent campaigner, and I would expect that once an election kicks off and you get the partisan juices flowing and everything, that some of his internal woes will start to dissipate a bit, and he probably, I expect, will make up ground rather than lose ground in an election campaign. Probably not enough to win just where we are now, but I definitely expect the Conservatives to probably go up, not down, once the campaign gets underway.
There's the other element for me where, like, the Liberals don't seem to like governing. Like, they don't seem to like to pass legislation. They're a bit slow at it. I guess the disadvantage for them in the current situation is the opposition has majorities on committees, so they can make their lives hell, like we'll get into in a bit with some of the motions that were passed towards the end of this parliament.
You see, I'm going to disagree with that slightly. I think they like governing. What they don't like doing is dealing with Parliament. They would they see it more as a mere formality on executing the PMO's whims more than anything else, as we'll get to with their rather brazen disregard for the basic parliamentary prerogatives and rights.
The executive branch, but not the legislative branch. If we go to an election then, what is the trigger? Because we passed the ability for a confidence vote to really come forward. The Budget Act could come back to the House and get defeated there, but that seems unlikely. So Trudeau has to go to the Governor General, or I guess to Chief Justice Wagner, and say, I need an election. What's his excuse and when does he do it?
They've already been laying around for the excuse. For weeks now, the PM and various Liberal partisans have been putting out there that Parliament is dysfunctional. And I mean, I would argue the majority of the dysfunction is of the Liberals' own making, but that is very much the message they are putting out there, that they just need a strong, stable majority government, so to speak, or at least they can't continue to work with this current parliament, and it needs to be dissolved and an election called.
This all sounds vaguely familiar for some reason. I feel like we've been through this dog and pony show before.
Although with the 2011 election that delivered said strong, stable majority government, I believe they did actually lose a confidence vote on there that kicked everything off.
Maybe I'm thinking of 2008, because that was when there was a fixed election date law, but Harper was like, no, we're not going to make it to that. I'm just going to spring one anyway. And that election was held on October 14th, which led to an inability to really bring forward government. Initially, we had that coalition crisis, and then we prorogued. It was a great fall. And then Michael Ignatieff had no spine, and Harper continued to govern for another 3 years, 2.5. I guess we're in that same situation. So yeah, I feel like summer election, not generally the best. It's a weird year because of the pandemic. You want to put the pandemic a little farther behind you.
Yeah, I think the usual arguments, I don't know, it depends how bad they think the post-pandemic economy, everything else is going to be after that. With everybody still confined a bit, the arguments against the summer election because everyone's going to be on vacation seem to be a little more muted this year, but yeah, I would expect probably September, maybe October for the actual election date.
So, if we go to an election, all the bills on the order paper die. Let's dig into what legislation may not become law then. Right now, the 4 bills that are remaining in the Senate at second reading that are, I'm presuming, going to be pretty hard fast-tracked, at least one of them, potentially all 4, by the Senate.
I don't think all 4 are going to be fast-tracked. One definitely.
Yeah.
2 of them quite likely. The last one, though, I think there was enough controversy of it going through the House that I think the Senate's going to take its time on.
So we already mentioned Bill C-30, the Budget Implementation Act. That's the money bill that needs to pretty much pass, or else we're going to an election a lot faster. So that'll probably clear. There's not a lot of opposition to the government's budget. There's the Conservative, we're the opposition and we oppose it. But I don't get the sense there's a strong enough reason. There could be some nitpicking, but even there, I don't know why the Senate would put their heels in on that bill.
Yeah, and when it comes to budget bills, there's an even stronger tendency or even stronger precedent that the Senate doesn't interfere with the House on those than other legislation. So yeah, the budget bill, I think, is pretty much a formality at this point. It's going to get through in the final week.
The next 2 that I think the Senate has pretty broad support for, but I'll be interested to see what pushback there is from the Conservative caucus or other members of the Senate, are C6, the conversion therapy ban, and C12, the Net Zero Accountability Act, which commits Canada to reaching net zero, I think, by 2050, if not sooner, maybe sooner, although net zero is the new buzzword. The conversion therapy bill is interesting. I've been following it closely. At second reading in the House, 7 Conservatives, if we count Derek Sloan, voted against it. But when it made it to third and final reading, the number grew to 63, I believe. Quite a few, just over half the Conservative caucus ultimately voted against it, which was more than I expected. Actually, it was close to what I pegged, but I was being pessimistic on that. I'll give credit, Aaron O'Toole voted in favor of the bill, as well as, I can't say too much about his front bench. I didn't know how they each voted, but a number of Conservatives did vote in favor of it, as well as all of the Liberals, NDP, Greens bloc who were there. I suspect there's at least 1 or 2 Conservatives in the Senate who would not grant it an easy ride, so it's not going to get a quick unanimous consent. The first sitting did have some pretty positive speeches, including by Paula Simons and others, about the value of the bill. The Net Zero Accountability Act, C12, I honestly have no clue how well that'll cruise through, and I actually don't know what effect it'll have if it doesn't.
Yeah, the effects are pretty minimal on that. If Trudeau does either come back just because he didn't call an election or because he won one, I see that getting reintroduced, or any amendments getting taken up rather quickly in the House and sent back to the Senate. It's the near-term effect of it is pretty much nil, so it's not going to make a huge difference one way or the other on that at all.
And that leaves the controversial one, C10, the changes to the Broadcasting Act, the thing that would try to update the CRTC for the 21st century, but in a way that made everyone go, really? Like that?
Yeah, we didn't really talk about this when it was the big news out of Ottawa for several weeks back in, would have been April, May of this year.
Time has no meaning.
But yeah, it got pretty controversial, mostly over the questions of whether social media would be included in that, whether that meant the CRTC was going to be regulating individual social media posts. All that was a big controversy. There's also some, I think, more peripheral concerns, or maybe not even peripheral concerns, but less directly public focused about the regulatory structures for the various companies and how that gets involved. I expect we'll see that dug into a bit in the Senate, and definitely the social media stuff will no doubt be a part of that.
Yeah, like I can understand the overarching aim and value of a bill like this. It is an immensely technical realm of Canadian law that, 3 people in Canada understand, if they do. One being Michael Geist, who everyone points to, and he's pretty skeptical of this bill, especially some of the changes the Liberals made or unmade at committee in the House, which was one removing a section that potentially suggested by removing it that your individual posts to Facebook and social media would now be subject to the CRTC, which seems weird. Like maybe there's an argument that YouTube should be subject to the CRTC. I don't necessarily buy that. You as a creator or us as podcasters being subject to the Broadcasting Act seems draconian's not the right word, overbearish.
Overly intrusive.
Yeah. So the CRTC is a clunky body that when it's working well, you don't hear about it, but that's very rarely. And usually you hear about it like agreeing with big telecom and helping the consolidation of media in Canada, which has generally been bad. So at very least, yeah, I expect a lot of scrutiny from the Senate on this. And if they make amendments, it'll have to recall the House of Commons, and we'll see how committed the Liberals are to passing this bill.
Yeah, in addition to those items, like another big part of the problem with the bill is I don't think they actually really seriously grappled with the fundamental changes that have happened in the way media and content works now. More or less basically took the system that existed in, I think it was the 90s when it was last updated, and tried to basically expand that same model out to various internet-based services. But the fundamental difference between cable or radio or any of those items back in the 90s versus the internet and internet-provided content now is that one is a broadcast model and the other's a on-demand model, and that just is a fundamentally different way to consume stuff. And they try and address that by putting requirements for algorithms to, have a certain amount of prominence for Canadian media and stuff. But fundamentally, if people don't want to watch it, just having it out there a little more prominently isn't going to make people click on it. And rather than trying to do that kind of old Canton model, I think it would be much better to think about, well, how do we actually create content that people will want to watch without having to be boosting it up artificially through any algorithm. And we can't do it. There are plenty of good Canadian media products that have appeal internationally or domestically as well. Letterkenny, Kim's Convenience, just to name a couple. Schitt's Creek. Like, all of these are shows that not only were hits in Canada, but have gained international prominence. And we should be, I think, much more thinking of how do we get Canadian content to be an export product rather than trying to be something we force Canadians to scroll past when they're trying to select what to watch on Netflix.
It's the same issue that the federal government seems to have had so often with the questions around the news and media failings. And there's such a reliance, especially in some of the early efforts, on the old dinosaurs, on the broadsheet newspapers, and how do we keep Post Media afloat, and how do we keep Toronto Star going when there are so many other smaller, more nimble upstarts trying to get into the market, and we're just really cut out of the initial funding structures early on. And I think it's gotten better, but it's still hard if we wanted to get, and we've looked at some of the programs a little bit, but if we wanted to get access to some of these new government programs, like becoming effectively a media charity, we still don't qualify despite providing news commentary on a regular basis that is purely Canadian content, because you have to be either connected to the Old Boys Club or one of these larger councils. So there's a failure of imagination in this government, I think, especially when it comes to the internet.
I don't necessarily say a failure of imagination. Well, Okay, failure of imagination is true, but I think more specifically, it's just a failure to understand the internet as what it is and not applying it like 1992 and Peter Mansbridge is explaining internet, this new thing that is like a television, but you can surf it. It's 2021. Nobody should be under the impression that the internet is just like old school broadcasting, and that internet-based news is like old broadsheets, but that doesn't seem to have made its way into the bowels of Ottawa yet for some strange reason.
There were so many younger staffers who came in with the Trudeau Liberals. Like, you think they would have cleared out the Chrétien Martin boomers who I could just see, like, I'm being purely ageist here, but wouldn't have understood the area as well. But you would have thought some of the younger team could have brought some different perspectives, but here we are. But if we're talking about failures in the federal government, we can talk about all of the bills that are going to fail to pass, assuming this election does happen. There are currently 13 government bills still in the House of Commons. Almost all of them, 12 of them, are still at second reading, which means they haven't even passed the main vote they need to go to deep committee consideration. Some of these are pretty esoteric ones that we have no clue what they really do, like C-20, the Nova Scotia and Newfoundland Additional Fiscal Equalization Offset Payments Act, or there's a couple other...
Oh, that probably has to do with the budgetary crisis Newfoundland has found itself in.
Which is apparently not a priority anymore, just like the amendments to the Federal Provincial Fiscal Arrangements Act. But there are some marquee bills in here that are not going anywhere. Things like the government's proposed digital charter, some of their firearms legislation, a number of criminal justice bills, including the much vaunted one they rolled out that would roll back a bunch of mandatory minimums. Like, critics said it didn't go far enough, but if you can't pass that, you're not doing anything, even. As well, right before the end of the sitting in the last month, they introduced a handful of additional bills. There was C-32, the Official Languages Amendments, which increased Francophone and French rights within the federal government services. There was a C-35, the Canada Disability Benefit Act, which was introduced just a couple days ago as a pretty prominent support for people with disabilities. A slap in the face to introduce it and then kill the bill right away. And then just yesterday on, I think the last day of sitting, or maybe they sat this morning, they introduced the Hate Crimes Amendments Act, C-36, which is quite the substantial bill from the place where I live and work in terms of civil liberties and freedom of expression and human rights and trying to protect all of these and balance all these different things. And it's just going to die. It's not going to go anywhere. Or maybe it'll be considered in the fall because Trudeau, I don't want to say doesn't like prorogation because now he's found it, but he never prorogued in the entire first majority government, which was weird. But maybe these
are we
will
going to have another Trudeau scandal in the next coming months?
Yeah, we already have one. We can talk about it in a bit. We're teasing it. It's all of the censure motions. So, it's not worth digging into what these bills specifically do, unless you're interested in...
I haven't read a couple of these. I do want to drill into the Official Languages Act changes at some point, but...
Not if the bill's going to die.
Yeah, I need to actually read up on a couple things there first before I can really pontificate on there. But that is potentially going to be quite an impactful bill that's worth looking into, and maybe if that comes back or we don't have an election, we can dig into it then.
And the other bill in the House is at the report stage. It's cleared committee, but hasn't been called for third reading. It's the Elections Canada amendments. If we have to host a pandemic election, here are all the controversial changes we'd make. Things that weren't necessarily that objectionable, things like having a second voting day and allowing more ways to vote that would allow people to socially distance and otherwise participate. But it was largely seen as we're probably going to throw a snap election this spring. Let's introduce a bill that we can justify hosting an election in a pandemic. And now that they can kick it to after most people have 2 vaccines, I think the urgency of that bill was lost. Well, and if we turn our attention to the other half of the ledger, the government can count some victories in terms of the bills passed. I want to start with the bills that originated in the Senate because I think they're adorable. The Senate passed three bills passed that originated in the Senate, notably the Kindness Week Act. This is a very substantive bill.
We were looking at it briefly before we started recording. It is a one-clause bill, or the actual substantive part is one clause. The whereas preamble about the Queen implementing it is longer than the actual text of the bill.
Throughout Canada, in each and every year, the third week of February is to be known as Kindness Week. Remember that next February, that you should be kind. It's not even like a proclamation. It's an official, we have a week of kindness now. I bet you didn't know that, listeners. They also made amendments to the Girl Guides of Canada Act. These are one of those obscure bits of legislation which aren't actually, in BC, they're known as private bills, and I think they are federally. They're like the government can pass a bill incorporating or changing how an organization is incorporated, and it only affects them. So a few churches are incorporated under that. In BC, a number of Bible colleges are incorporated under private bills because it allows them to exempt from the Universities Act, so they can grant degrees without having to follow all of the other requirements of a university. Generally, the organization comes forward and says, we need changes to our governing structure. Parliament or the legislature, can you make these changes? And it usually goes through pretty uncontroversially. It does raise a lot of... Sorry?
Do you know what's actually in this one?
I have no clue. I don't know how the Girl Guides were constituted prior to this and what amendments were made. I didn't pull it up, unfortunately. I do like them. They're a very neat quirk of our government system. More importantly, though, 17 government bills did pass. A lot of them were related to interim financing because, as we've talked about, we didn't have a budget for a year. So there were a lot of let's keep paying for things bills, as well as some COVID measures and things to just keep the wage subsidy going, that kind of. More notably, though, the bill to require judges to take sexual assault training passed. I think this was one that Rona Ambrose had introduced as a private member's bill before the prorogation.
Well, she's not even in Parliament anymore. This was from the first Trudeau term. She introduced it there. It slowly made its way through. I think eventually got killed when they had the last election, and then got reintroduced here, this time by the government, but basically, as far as I know, taking up the same structure. So this has been a long time in the works.
Yeah.
Half a decade, I think.
Yeah. And it's good to see that kind of cross-partisan support on something like this. I think this followed some of the controversies a number of years ago when you had judges talking about two sexual assault victims. Why didn't you just keep your legs shut? This is why that bill was necessary. This wouldn't have solved that judge because the government can't tell sitting judges what to do, but it will require new judges to take some sexual assault training, which will make hopefully a bit of help to the future of our justice system. It's obviously not going to end all the problems, but hopefully make some of those experiences less re-traumatizing. On the Indigenous rights side, 3 bills were actually passed in this legislature, or in this Parliament sitting. The bill creating the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation passed, so September 30th is a new national holiday for anyone in a federally regulated industry.
It'll be up to the provinces to actually pass their own bills. They want make that a statutory holiday for non-federally regulated workers, which is most workers.
Yeah, outside like telecoms, transportation, banking. It's pretty much everyone else, but
federal employees.
Yeah, this is one that I think was a call from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as another bill which came through, which changed the citizenship oath to also require people to uphold our charter obligations or treaty obligations, I believe, is now added to the citizenship oath. Like both relatively symbolic, but still steps in the right direction, I think. And they're symbols that people will come across and reminds us of the stuff we talked about off the top and the work we still have to do. And I think the more controversial of the three of these bills was the UNDRIP Act, the federal version of what BC passed a couple years ago now, it feels like, the bringing the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples into Canadian law and into British Columbian law. There was a bit of controversy around this one. There was a lot of pushback from conservative circles around the concerns over free, prior, and informed consent for resource extraction, as well as in some Indigenous circles, there were critics who felt this was more symbolic than substantive, and they didn't trust the government, which I totally could understand. But ultimately, the supporters won the day. Additionally, I think one of the more controversial bills the Liberals faced was getting through their amendments to the assisted dying legislation that came through, feels like 2 months ago now, might have been even more. But this was in response to a Quebec Superior Court ruling that found parts of their previous assisted dying legislation to be unconstitutional. And rather than contest that to the Quebec Court of Appeal and Supreme Court eventually, they just chose to try to incorporate that judge's ruling into the law. Their MAID is still going to be on the agenda as there are follow-up reports to be completed. So we'll be coming back to this conversation again and again as we continue to develop our assisted dying regime in Canada.
Yeah. And I think the final bill from the government side that passed was a back-to-work legislation for the Port of Montreal.
Liberals are always keen to get those bills passed. I found it also interesting 6 private members' bills passed. Here in BC, we almost never see a private member's bill go anywhere. And with a minority parliament in Ottawa, it's nice to see that some of these actually went through. I think 4 of them were, or I think a few of them were fairly minor. There was a national framework for diabetes that will be valuable for people who have diabetes, but like the environmental legislation we talked about earlier, or even the net zero stuff, without money and clear requirements, it's not sure how much that will change. They've added bereavement leave to the federal labor code, which is probably overdue. But 2 that I found interesting is sports betting is now legal. That was a notable bill passed just this week.
I have to admit, I did not know it was illegal, but I'm not much of a gambler.
Yeah, I guess there was a lot of black market sports betting, but you couldn't bet on the outcome of the next Canadiens game in the playoffs. Essentially, this allows the provinces to now set up regulatory regimes. So we'll see what each province does going forward. I don't think, unfortunately, that this bill will allow politics betting, so we won't be able to place bets on the next federal election like you can in the UK and the US. Although in Canada, in BC, I think you can place bets through the BC gaming website on other countries' elections. I remember you could bet on.
I mean, the theoretical reason why they don't allow betting on elections is because they don't want people to influence their vote or try and influence others to win a bet. But they honestly don't care if, say, Canadians really care who the next Prime Minister of Ireland is and want to wager on that. It's a little too removed for it to...
You also risk some insider knowledge. Not a ton, but maybe someone in the campaign knows something that the average bettor wouldn't. This bill was also interesting because the Liberals had introduced their own sports betting bill, but the one that ultimately passed was a private member's bill from the Conservative Party, and the Liberals managed to work together with the Conservative member to bring the best of both parts, because I guess there were horse racing concerns about this, of course. So anyway, sports betting is now legal. As well, Conservative Len Weber from Calgary got through an organ and tissue donor act that will allow the CRA to work with the provinces to set up organ and tissue donor registries, which seems like a really good thing that's long overdue.
Yeah. The CRA seems a weird partner, but I'm guessing the idea here is that, like you check off on your taxes every year, the choice to register to vote at the same time and share that information with Elections Canada. I'm going to guess that basically piggybacking off that, but with, well, Health Canada, I would guess, in this case and their provincial counterparts.
Yeah, I think I would suspect that's exactly what it is. And it's a good step. I'm still a fan of the opt-out organ donation system, where you're default harvestable unless you say I would rather not be. I think Nova Scotia is moving that direction, but elsewhere in Canada, there's not a lot of momentum yet.
That's too bad, because I agree. That's definitely the right way to structure things.
Besides legislation, the Liberals had a tough end to the Parliament as they faced a series of pretty damning votes. There was a motion to find the government in contempt of Parliament and a motion to censure one minister. You want to take us through?
Yeah, so the motion to censure minister relates to Harjit Sajjan and the now months-long scandal related to various leadership failings and sexual misconduct in the Canadian Forces. And as a result of that, and the minister's lack of cooperation with Parliament on this file and such things, they voted to censure him this week. Strictly speaking, it doesn't do much but indicate discontent by Parliament. Nevertheless, it's a fairly rare occurrence.
Yeah, it's weird that the government serves at the pleasure of the House, but the House can't, remove a minister.
That's because technically the sovereign appoints the ministers.
Yeah. Yeah, I also get it.
If the first minister loses the confidence of the House, that's really the way it ultimately ends up generating the accountability.
Government was found in contempt. This is the, third time the federal government has been found in contempt of Parliament since 2010?
Yeah, so there's the contempt that was directed towards Harper.
There was two for Harper. There was, I believe...
So there's the Afghan detainee. What was the other one?
I believe it was releasing documents around the F-35s. Okay, and that was the one right before the 2011 election, because he made that. It's all a little fuzzy. It was a while ago. Governments in Westminster systems didn't used to be found in contempt, but now the British Parliament has slapped a contempt motion against their government for failing to disclose legal advice around Brexit. So, I don't know, governments are getting more and more contemptible. They dislike responding to Parliament.
Yeah. More generally, I would actually say what's happening is that the basic structure of responsible government that underpins all Westminster systems is breaking down. Not so much formally, but the norms that uphold it are pretty rapidly eroding.
Yeah.
Which is bad. It shouldn't happen.
Yeah. So the latest contempt motion was last Thursday. We had it in our notes for the podcast, but we ended up running long, so we cut it. The motion relates around I think it's the China Committee, and now the House of Commons as a whole, continuing to ask the Public Health Agency for documents around why 2 individuals were removed and fired from this National Microbiology Laboratory in Winnipeg.
And stripped of security clearances?
Yeah, a bunch of weird stuff happened, and a few viruses were transferred to China's Wuhan Institute of Virology, none of which seemed to mesh with anyone's public understanding or what's going on, which is what Parliament and the Commons Committee wanted to find out. Public Health Agency of Canada denied the request, citing national security issues, which is under the Evidence Act their right to do, but at some point Parliament is supreme in this country, and if they're saying, give us the things, they're supposed to give them the things.
Yeah, ultimately Parliament can pretty much subpoena anything in the country, and they have that inherent ability. So they're really, the executive branch and the public service just don't get to tell the Parliament to screw off.
And so this escalated to the point where earlier this week, President of the Public Health Agency, Ian Stewart, was required to appear at the bar of Parliament in the House of Commons, and he got a verbal lashing down from the Speaker of the House, Anthony Rota, ironically a Liberal, but Rota is doing his job as the Speaker. I actually watched a bit of this because I was trying to tune into the conversion therapy debate, and it was delayed because there were points of order on points of order, and then just like a queue of points of order as MPs. First, like the government House leader objected to this entire circus happening, and then the Conservatives objected to that objection because Parliament had said this has to happen. And then following that, there was just a series of statements as points of order. I was only half listening, so I got lost. But there, in the midst of all of that, Stewart was dressed down by the Speaker of the House. After that, some of the Liberal speeches involved wasn't that was embarrassing and shouldn't have happened. That's so disrespectful to a public servant. And so the government could just do what Parliament is telling and let go of these documents.
Yeah,
but
it's worth noting that the clerk of the House reviews all of this stuff, and anything that is sensitive to national security doesn't get released publicly. But nevertheless, the MPs, if they collectively decide they want to subpoena something, absolutely have the right to see.
That question's going to be put before the courts now, as the Liberals are suing the Speaker, Anthony Rota, and Parliament to try to block the release of this, which is quite the move.
Like that, don't think that's ever happened before in any Westminster government. Courts don't like to intervene in Parliament's internal workings. They are very loath to do. And as you mentioned, those are the basic inherent powers of Parliament and parliamentary supremacy here. Like, they're really, as far as I can tell, no leg for them to stand on. And most governments wouldn't even try this maneuver.
I wonder if it's simply a delay tactic, hoping that the court won't be able to do anything until post an election, and if they have a majority, they can just make it go away.
Perhaps. They're already having a bit of a delay. There's, in the story here, one of the things that Parliament had asked for was that the Speaker send the Sergeant-at-Arms to enforce their subpoena and march down to the Public Health Agency and physically secure those records. Now, the Speaker held off on doing that pending some other items, but they're already delaying a bit on this.
My God, can you just imagine being the private security guard working at the front of that office and or RCMP, and then having the Sergeant-at-Arms and the Parliament cops?
Yeah, it would have been quite the spectacle, but one that I don't know has ever happened in Canada, but something that Parliament has the right to do. And honestly, the more the government drags this out, the more they should consider exercising that prerogative. You know,
I just feel bad for the beat cops or the frontline security guard who probably has no clue about the existence of the Sergeant-at-Arms security force and their authority. Like, your average cop has a woefully inadequate understanding of the law too often, like in terms of press freedoms and issues like that. But those are common occurrences and things that will run up. The Sergeant-at-Arms marching on you doesn't happen. And I wouldn't expect cops to know what to do in that situation. I'm not saying it's going to get violent or anything. I think it's just going to be confusing for everyone.
Yeah, there would be a lot of confusion that would result out of that.
I'll be curious to see if anything, the courts say about this. The standoff clearly hasn't finished. And yeah, I'm not a big fan of the precedents that are being set, both by the previous government and now this government, in terms of respect for the institutions.
Yeah, it's real bad. The basic underlying theory that underpins our government is that the government, quote unquote, the executive branch, the PM and the ministers, are so basically granted the confidence of the House and are ultimately accountable to the House. And that is not really happening. And like I mentioned earlier, the way the Liberals are approaching this is they see the House as an extension of the PMO, more or less, or acting like that should be the way things are. And that's just a fundamentally wrong in view of how our government works, and ultimately it undermines the very legitimacy that it operates on.
But I can almost guarantee you that one thing Canadians generally don't vote on is how respectful the government is of democratic institutions. That can build up as an issue over time. It's around ethics, transparency, and all of that.
2015, Harper definitely suffered from the cumulative effects of that.
But it takes a decade.
Yeah, I don't think Trudeau's at that point. Yeah, which is unfortunate, because if we do have an election, I really don't think it's good for the country if the outcome of that is that the Liberals get a majority and basically are allowed to do an end run around parliamentary accountability, particularly after these rather precedent-breaking moves by them.
It happened in 2011. It can happen again.
Just for the general constitutional order of the country, the Liberals should not get a majority after pulling this stunt.
If they do, they will get to continue appointing more people to the Senate, as they did this week, with 3 more new senators being appointed to fill the 15 vacancies that are up there. The Senate has had a rough while, I think, going back to the early Harper years when he had a general principle of not appointing anyone to the Senate, first because he was trying to get unelected Senate, and then because I think he believed if he could just not appoint enough that he could atrophy it away, until the Supreme Court said, you can't do that, please do your duty and fill the
I think
Senate.
It was more practical. Try to remember. I think it was more practical reasons that he just needed votes to get stuff passed through the Senate. Definitely after the Senate reference, he went full on, I think, appointing. I'm a little fuzzy on the recollection. He definitely didn't appoint many in his last year, and I think that was as much a fallout from the Duffy affair as anything else.
You don't want to draw attention to the embarrassing chamber.
It did leave plenty of Senate seats open for Trudeau to go on an appointing spree with, which maybe from a basic strategy point of view wasn't great for the Conservatives to do.
Well, with these new 3 senators, Trudeau has now appointed 55 senators. The total makeup of the Senate would be 105, but I believe it's about 93 right now with the appointments this week. Those are Hassan Youssef for Ontario, a former president of the Canadian Labour Congress, who you would hear union president and assume to be pretty close with the NDP, but this was pretty widely seen as someone who was much cushier with the Liberals and was maybe even courting a Senate seat for quite a while. Bernadette Clement was a lawyer and current mayor of Cornwall, Ontario, and past Liberal candidate in the 2011 and 2015 elections. But don't worry, this is a very nonpartisan process we're using now to appoint senators.
Yeah, just so happens that 2-time Liberal candidate made the cut.
And finally, for New Brunswick, James Quinn, a senior member of the Coast Guard and the CEO of St. John Port Authority, is now in the Senate. And I don't know anything about his partisan stripes, but sounds like a accomplished person.
Yeah, a lot of the appointed senators in this independent process are not strictly speaking Liberals, although as we just saw with Bernadette Clement, that's not always the case. But it's definitely not a process that picks people that are not in general alignment with the Liberal Party overall. So they may not be partisan, but it's not generally kicking up a huge amount of political diversity either.
Yeah, I think we see that in terms of the makeup of the Senate right now, because the large number of independents now have formed 3 groups. The Conservatives have 20 seats in the Senate. Those people are still caucusing with the Conservative Party of Canada. The largest group is the Independent Senators Group. This was the first one to form, and I think is the most centrist liberal of them all. Eventually that broke off and a Canadian Senators Group formed, and I think that's the more conservative one. I remember because it starts with C. And they have 12, as does the Progressive Senate Group, which I would suspect would be the slightly more left-leaning one. And then there's 5 who refuse to identify with even the Independent Senators Group. That's the Senate, and that's why no one can pass anything, because none of those groups have a majority, and even within those groups, they don't always vote the same, especially the Independent Senators Group.
Also, when Trudeau made his changes, he fundamentally changed the underlying legitimacy of the Senate, and when it was just a place where you stuck your partisan hats, that did make it so that they at least knew they didn't have any real legitimacy in the eyes of Canadians and accorded themselves with that understanding. But now that there's an independent merits-based process, that does up the legitimacy somewhat, and the senators are making use of that newfound legitimacy. Not to the point of necessarily going fully against the elected House, but definitely exercising their powers a little more and digging into bills a bit more. That's also making things tough, and it may make things even tougher should there be a partisan change in who's leading the House in the coming months.
A little more sober second thought is happening, I guess. You're also seeing a lot more lobbying of senators now that they're exercising that second thought, but I'm conscious of our time, so let's mention the other nomination that happened this week. Mahmoud Jamal has been named to the Supreme Court of Canada. He is the first person of color to get nominated to the Supreme Court. Pretty historic replacement for Rosalie Abella, who's leaving. Jamal was born in Kenya, raised in England, did high school in Edmonton. He's a pretty accomplished lawyer. He's worked on a ton of pro bono cases, from civil, constitutional, criminal. I looked at his resume at one point. He's done work for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, among others. Seems like a pretty well-respected, good pick. So yeah, be interesting to see what perspectives he brings to the court once he starts writing just judgments. And I think this is Trudeau's, I want to say, 4th pick for the Supreme Court as well.
Could be. What was it? Roe? The only one I can remember was Roe, and then the elevation of Wade. There were a couple others too. It's a good sign that Supreme Court picks aren't particularly politically controversial or salient in Canada. We definitely don't want the situation they have down in the US. Although I am somewhat worried about how long that's going to be able to be maintained, just because as more policy making gets shifted from Parliament to the courts, the incentives to pay more attention to Supreme Court justices' political leadings is just going to grow. And that's not a great thing.
Yeah, Trudeau also appointed Sheila Martin of Alberta and Nicolas Cazère from Quebec, an increasingly Trudeau-dominated court. Although Chief Justice Wagner was actually appointed by Harper as well as 4 others, but many of them actually fall on the more liberal side, so it's quite the interesting makeup. And it'll be interesting to see where Jamal falls.
Yeah, of course, there's still no word on when we're finally going to get a new Governor General, hopefully before there's an election called, because just not great that there isn't one in place when there's potential post-election arrangements that have to be handled and appointments made.
Yeah, we have lots of other astronauts we can pick from.
Moving on to a hopefully very quick take, because the time has gone a little long here on our recording. Couple items out of the BC Liberal leadership race. There's a new entrant, Val Littman, the former CEO of the BC Chamber of Commerce. Very enthusiastic in his campaign video. That's about all I can really tell you about him.
Had you heard of him before?
I'm sure I've come across the name, but like it wasn't someone I particularly recognized.
Yeah, like I didn't pay too close attention to the Chamber of Commerce, but
Admittedly, neither do I.
had not heard of his. Yeah, his video is really slick though. There's some like things I could tease for. He starts off by saying no slogans, and then there's like a ton of slogans. But
The thing that I picked out from that is that he correctly says it's not 2011. We can't talk like it's 2011. The only problem is several of the following talking points would be very well at home in a 2011 BC Liberal ad.
yeah, his LinkedIn right now says his purpose is to redefine what success looks like for women, families, small business, urban and rural BC. There was a lot in there about getting taxes and regulation out of the way, standard kind of BC Liberal talking point of the last decade.
Yeah,
Or more.
and I mean, him, Gavin Dew, who we'll talk about in a moment. Like, there's a couple candidates who are very clear on the we need renewal and a change in direction, or we need renewal, a new face, all of that stuff. What I'm not really seeing, and there needs to happen in the BC Liberal leadership race, and whoever they eventually select as leaders, the problem isn't necessarily that you can just, slap a new coat of paint on it and it's good to go. Things have changed in the province, and the BC Liberals need to update a lot of their thinking on a lot of things, and that doesn't mean go back and abandon the past principles. The principles are good, but you can't necessarily get locked into a particular implementation of those principles when they're not operationalized into a policy platform. And you can't just keep that policy platform around forever, which is what the various candidates have done so far, is try and update the framing around it, but more or less taking the same policies and try and give them a new shine, rather than doing what I think the right generally in Canada needs to do, is that it needs to go back to the first principles and apply them to the current situation, because it's not the 90s, it's not 2011 anymore. The province is just in a different place, and you need to take those basic values and figure out how they actually get applied to the current circumstance, and that so far hasn't happened, and I don't see much sign that it's happening here.
We'll have to put those questions to Val and to the other leadership contestants that we haven't talked to yet, including Kevin Falcon, who increasingly seems like the front runner. I just want to note that on Val Litwin's LinkedIn, he worked as Nurse Next Door's vice president of franchise operations for 2 years from 2011 to 2013. And I just find that a hilarious connection to past NPA mayoral candidate and now independent, probably a better city, Vancouver mayoral candidate Ken Sim. It's a small world in BC politics. But what is Gavin Dew's big idea? He launched his BC Future Economy. He launched his Believe in BC Future Economy Pack this week, which is his economic platform, I guess.
It's a sizable chunk of it. Like, I still feel there's some more areas that should be added to in it. So, I have a feeling this won't be the last bit of economic policy that'll be put out.
Hopefully, because there's some interesting and good language in here. I feel like the specifics are still quite vague in terms of we should just develop increased post-secondary educational capacity in rural and remote communities, which is something that is underway. Like every government is working to build, expand University of Northern British Columbia, put more into UBC Okanagan, and create access for people who are outside even those communities. Did you find anything particularly stimulating in here?
Honestly,
I'm not the target
no.
audience.
Yeah, I'm more of the target audience for both this and the Val Litwin video, and it hits a bunch of the stuff that a bunch of Liberals will find generally agrees with their outlook on things, but there isn't a huge amount in there that I think grabs attention, and I think part of it is we're going to cut barriers, remove red tape stuff. I think that's increasingly lost its luster. And more specifically, if it's not tied to a very specific barrier, it's hard to, I think, convey that and get people bought into the need to do it. And that's not really here. Like, there are definitely areas in the provincial autonomy where regulatory barriers are absolutely a problem and causing huge issues that are adversely affecting people. Land use and zoning and all that is probably the most obvious example. Like, there's a real
Although, ironically, the housing industry is still employing a lot of people and still fueling our economy and preventing it from being in.
Yeah, it's a lot of that's selling the old units back and forth between people rather than...
but yes, it is definitely harming people.
Yeah, but like that is something that's like a tangible... There is this barrier in the way. We can get rid of that, and it will create these direct benefits to people from that. A lot of the stuff in here is a little general and vague, and don't expect any leadership candidate to put out a 200-page PDF going into details on all of that stuff. As much as I would personally like that, it's just not a realistic expectation. A certain amount of high-level stuff is good, but without tying it into something concrete, I feel it misses the mark a bit on some of this stuff, and more specific, and just going even more high level on this, I feel like the general ideological and political project of the right from kind of the 1980s onward has more or less reached its natural endpoint. We've basically settled on what the size and role of government is. It's not really going to budge that much one way or the other. It's not going to be slashed down lower than it is now, but neither are we going to be nationalizing a bunch of industries and having the government take over large sectors of the economy. Like, it's
not with that attitude.
It's basically locked into an equilibrium, and that being the defining question that politics is oriented around is just not the case anymore. I don't think any party's really put their finger or figured out what the next big dividing question that the parties orient themselves around, that coalitions are built on each side of. That hasn't been figured out yet. And whoever does is going to have a pretty big first mover advantage on that. But that needs to be done, because everything I've seen so far from all the Liberal candidates still is in that past frame and still trying to answer the question that was really important 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but isn't the same question, or isn't the question that needs to be or will be on people's minds in the future. And nobody really seems to be branching out and experimenting and trying to actually find that next question to answer.
So we'll have to keep our eyes on the Liberal leadership race as maybe one of them finds an answer.
And that has been Playtoast. Find links to everything we talked about at playtoast.ca. Support the show and get access to our Slack channel at patreon.com/playtoast. Our intro music credit is Beautiful British Columbia by Serge Plotnikoff. Playtoast is a production of Legend Boot Media, and editing services are provided by CHLY 101.7 FM in Nanaimo. Wash your hands and stay home. Thanks for listening.